low in the sky, casting its pale silvery light over the desolate landscape. A cold wind swept through the streets, whispering secrets only the night could understand. In the heart of the city, the sounds of life seemed to fade into oblivion, swallowed by an ever-present silence that wrapped itself around everything like a suffocating cloak. The people, if there were any left, hid away in the shadows, afraid of what might be watching from the dark corners of the world. And yet, in the stillness of the night, there was movement, a figure cloaked in shadow, moving with purpose but without direction. Qiao Bailu, once known for her brilliance and promise, now wandered the streets like a lost soul, as if the weight of her own thoughts were too heavy to bear. Her eyes, once bright with ambition, now reflected nothing but the void she had found herself trapped in. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as though she was walking through a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. The city seemed to mock her, its empty streets a reminder of the life she had once dreamed of, but now felt slipping through her fingers, like grains of sand in the wind. It was in the silence that she heard it, the faint, almost imperceptible voice, whispering from the depths of her mind. "You are nothing," it said. "No matter how hard you try, you will always fall short." Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat as she fought to banish the voice, but it clung to her like a dark shadow, twisting her thoughts into a labyrinth of doubt and fear. The memories of her past life, of mistakes and regrets, flooded her mind like a relentless tide. How many times had she failed? How many dreams had she shattered, only to be left with nothing but the pieces of her broken heart? In the distance, the faint glow of a street lamp flickered, drawing her gaze. For a moment, it was as if the world had paused, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, like a crack in the darkened sky, a sudden realization washed over her. It was her brother, Qiao Genting, who had brought her to this place, to this moment of profound isolation. She had never understood him, never fully realized the depths of his pain, his fear. He had been nothing but a shadow in her life, a mere reflection of her own failings. But now, as the cold wind howled around her, she understood. She had been running from him, running from the truth, from the very thing that she had been too afraid to face. Her mind raced, the realization clawing at her chest. "Why did you leave me behind?" she wondered, her voice barely a whisper in the empty street. The truth was simple, yet painfully elusive. In her pursuit of greatness, of escaping the life that had imprisoned her, she had left her brother behind. She had ignored his struggles, his silent cries for help, because she was too consumed by her own ambitions. And now, standing in the quiet darkness, she realized that she had lost something far more precious than any dream. A gust of wind swept through the alley, knocking over a stray newspaper that fluttered in the wind like a forgotten ghost. It was then that she heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the distance. She turned, her heart leaping in her chest as her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. Her eyes darted to the shadows, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the haunting silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And yet, she could feel it, an eerie presence lingering just beyond the edge of her perception. It was as if the city itself had come alive, watching her every move, waiting for her to make a choice. The weight of her past, the guilt, the regrets, all seemed to press down on her like an unrelenting force, threatening to crush her. But within that darkness, she also felt something else, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility. In that moment, she realized that she was no longer running from her past. She had to confront it, face the truth that had been hiding in the shadows for so long. Her brother, her family, her very soul, everything was tied to this moment. There was no turning back. As the footsteps grew louder, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. This was her reckoning. The darkness that had consumed her for so long was now the very thing that would set her free. Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure emerged from the shadows, the faint glimmer of recognition in their eyes. It was him, her brother Qiao, Bailu. He had been the one to pull her from the depths of despair, to show her that there was more to life than the shadows that threatened to swallow her whole. But even as they stood there, in the heart of the city, their fates hanging in the balance, Qiao Bailu knew that this was only the beginning. The darkness that had once consumed her was now her ally, her guide, leading her toward a future she could never have imagined. And though she stood on the precipice of a new beginning, she knew that the battle was far from over. The city whispered around her, the wind carrying with it the scent of something ancient, something forgotten. She closed her eyes, letting the wine caress her face as the weight of her past faded into the distance. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to feel something else. Hope. But as the night continued to unfold, she could not shake the feeling that something darker was still lurking just beyond the horizon. Something that would test her, break her, and perhaps even destroy her. And yet, she stood there, resolute, ready to face whatever lay ahead. For in the heart of darkness, there is always a spark of light, a flicker of hope that refuses to die, and Qiao Bailu would cling to that light, no matter the cost. As Qiao Bailu walked through the desolate streets, the cold wind biting at her skin, her thoughts were consumed by the growing rift between her and her brother, Qiao Bailu. It wasn't the kind of division that could be easily seen or understood by the outside world. No, theirs was a war waged silently, hidden behind the walls of their home, beneath the surface of seemingly trivial disagreements. But the crack in their bond had grown wider over the years, and now, for the first time, Qiao Bailu realized just how deep it went. She had always thought of herself as the protector, the one who could guide her brother toward a brighter future. She had assumed that if she could make something of herself, he would follow her lead, as siblings often did. But in truth, her sense of control was an illusion, one that had crumbled as she looked into the tired, defeated eyes of Qiao Bailu. His rejection of school, his refusal to follow the path that she had so carefully laid out for him, felt like a personal failure. a direct result of her inability to understand the pain he had been carrying. "Why don't you want to go to school?" she had asked him that night, her voice a mixture of frustration and disbelief. But instead of answering, he had simply looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "What's the point?" Qiao Genting finally muttered, his voice quiet, almost broken. "No one cares anyway. It's all just a waste of time." The words cut through her like a dagger, the truth behind them as sharp and painful as any physical wound. She had always thought her brother simply lacked ambition, that he was lazy, refusing to put in the effort. How many times had she scolded him for not trying harder? How many times had she told him he could do better, only to have him shut down, refusing to engage with her? She had never stopped to consider that perhaps his resistance was a cry for help, an expression of something deeper, something darker. His rejection of school was not about defiance, it was about defeat. Qiao Genting had already given up on himself, and no amount of pleading, no amount of coaxing from his older sister could change that. It was this realization that shattered Qiao Bailu's sense of control. For the first time, she saw her brother not as the lazy, stubborn boy who had always frustrated her, but as someone who had been consumed by his own insecurities, someone drowning in a sea of self-doubt. She remembered their childhood, the way he had always been different from her, quiet, reserved, and always more contented to be in the background than to step into the spotlight. She had always been the star of their family, the one who excelled, the one everyone looked to for guidance. But in her pursuit of her own success, she had failed to notice the way he silently withered, the way he crumbled under the weight of her expectations. She had never seen the strain in his shoulders, the tension in his face when she demanded more from him. She had never understood how much he feared being overshadowed by her brilliance, how much he felt inferior in comparison to her. Now, as they stood together in the dim light of their shared space, the divide between them was clearer than ever. The words they exchanged were laced with a bitterness that neither could hide, each sentence a reminder of the distance that had grown between them. Qiao Bailu tried to reach out, her voice soft with a mix of desperation and guilt. "Genting, don't you want something more than this? Don't you want to be someone?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, as though she were afraid of the answer. But Qiao Genting only looked away, his face unreadable. The walls he had built around himself were impenetrable, and no matter how hard she tried, she could not tear them down. His rejection of her words was not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. He was tired, tired of fighting, tired of pretending, tired of trying to meet expectations that felt like an insurmountable mountain. "I don't want to be someone," he replied quietly. "I just want to be left alone." The air between them grew heavy with the weight of their unspoken words, the tension thickening with every passing second. Qiao Bailu's heart ached as she looked at him, her brother, the one person who had always been there, and yet he felt so far away. She had spent so much time building her own future, striving for something bigger, but in doing so, she had abandoned the very person who had once looked up to her, the very person who had needed her the most. Her mind flashed to the past, to the moments when they had shared laughter, when they had been close, when everything had seemed simple and full of promise. But now, all of that felt like a distant memory, like a dream that had faded with the passing years. "I've tried, Genting," she said, her voice breaking. "I've tried to help you, to show you that there's more to life, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to help you." There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice low but filled with a quiet bitterness. "You can't fix this," he said, his words like a knife in her chest. "You don't understand. You never have." Her heart sank, but she refused to let the weight of his words break her. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she was finally beginning to understand the depth of the struggle he had been hiding for so long. His refusal to go to school was not just a rebellion. It was a plea for help, a cry for someone to see the pain he had been carrying alone. But in her own pursuit of success, she had never bothered to look. Qiao Bailu stood in the silence that followed, the cold air pressing in on her from all sides. For the first time, she understood the true depth of her brother's pain, the pain that had driven him to shut everyone out, even her. The realization hit her like a wave, sweeping away everything she had believed to be true. She had been blind, and now it was too late to turn back. "Genting," she whispered, her voice filled with the sorrow. "I'm sorry. I didn't see it. I didn't see you." But her apology felt hollow, a mere echo in the vast emptiness between them. She knew that no words could fix what had been broken. No promises could erase the years of neglect and misunderstanding. All she could do now was stand there in the silent dark and hope that somehow, some way, they could find a way back to each other. Qiao Bailu stood alone in the small room, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the blank page in front of her. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint rustle of paper and the distant hum of the city outside. Her mind raced with visions of a future where she was a renowned screenwriter, a name whispered in awe across the country. In her mind's eye, she could already see it. Her stories on the big screen, a life of success, a life far from the shadows of failure that had long plagued her. She had always seen herself as something more than just a sister, something greater, something destined for greatness, the great sister. She would tell herself, even when the doubts crept in, "I am the one who will rise above. I will change everything." These were the words she lived by, the mantra that kept her going through the sleepless nights and the endless struggles. It was the only way she could justify the sacrifices she had made, sacrifices that had cost her so much, not just in time and effort, but in relationships. She thought about her brother, Qiao Genting, and felt a pang of guilt, but she quickly buried it. She had to focus. She had to move forward. She had big dreams, dreams that were supposed to lift not only her, but everyone around her. She would write a novel. She would become a screenwriter, the best in the industry. She could already picture herself in front of a massive crowd, the applause deafening as she accepted the award she had worked so hard to earn. "This is my future," she told herself again, with a sense of conviction that felt almost too strong, too unwavering. I will make it happen. Nothing will stop me. The problem, though, was that beneath all her grand aspirations, something was wrong. Deep inside, she knew it. It had been gnawing at her for a while now, but she refused to face it. She was lying to herself. Her dreams were not the bright light guiding her forward. They were the very thing blinding her to the reality of the present. In her pursuit of success, she had become so absorbed in her own vision of a perfect future that she had lost sight of everything else. Her family, her brother, her true feelings. She had convinced herself that she was doing everything for them, for the good of the family. But in truth, she was doing it for herself. It wasn't just her brother who had been left behind. It was everyone around her. Her constant drive for success had become a shield, a way for her to protect herself from confronting the reality of her failures, her insecurities. Qiao Bailu could not see it, not yet. She refused to acknowledge that she had been running away from her own fears. It was easier to believe in the future she had created in her mind than to accept the broken pieces of her past. She had been telling herself that her success would fix everything, that it would erase the mistakes she had made, the relationships she had neglected, the people she had hurt. She had convinced herself that if she could just achieve her dream, everything else would fall into place. I will prove them wrong, she repeated quietly, almost to herself, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it true. But even as she sat there, pen in hand, her thoughts drifting back to the cold silence between her and Xiao Genting, a knot tightened in her stomach. She thought about their last conversation, his refusal to go to school, his quiet resignation. How had she missed it? How had she not seen the pain he was hiding, the desperate cry for help buried beneath his indifference? She had been so wrapped up in her own ambitions that she hadn't noticed him slipping away. She had failed him, just as she had failed herself. And yet, she still didn't know how to fix it. Qiao Bailu stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She walked over to the window, looking out at the city that stretched endlessly before her. The lights flickered in the distance, a reflection of the false hope that had kept her moving forward. She told herself that if she could just achieve her dream, just become the person she had always wanted to be, then maybe, just maybe, she could start to make things right. But even as she thought it, she knew that it was a lie. Her dream would never fill the emptiness inside her, and her brother, her family, they needed more than her success. They needed her to be there, to be present, to listen. The truth began to seep in, slow and heavy, like a dark cloud moving across the sky. She was not the great sister she had always believed herself to be. She was just a girl, trying to outrun the darkness of her own failures. And in doing so, she had left everything behind. She had pushed her brother into the shadows, abandoned the very people who had loved her. And for what? A dream that felt more like a prison than a promise. Qiao Bailu closed her eyes, pressing her hands against her forehead as if trying to push the realization away. But it wouldn't leave. It lingered, settling like a weight on her chest. She had no idea how to fix it. She had no idea how to go back and make amends for the years she had spent chasing a future that might never come. She had convinced herself that becoming a screenwriter would solve everything. But now, she saw the truth. Her dream had only taken her further from the people who mattered most. "What am I doing?" she whispered into the silence of her room, the words barely audible. And in that moment, she realized just how far she had gone. She had been so focused on her own aspirations that she had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered: the connection she shared with her brother, her family. She had pushed them away, and in doing so, had lost herself. The path ahead was unclear, shrouded in the same darkness she had been running from for so long. But as she stood there, staring out into the night, a small spark of understanding flickered within her. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to face the truth about herself, about her brother, about the life she had been too afraid to live. For the first time, Qiao Bailu allowed herself to truly see the damage she had done. And for the first time, she wondered if it was too late to fix it. Qiao Bailu sat in the dim light of her room, her gaze fixed on the blank page in front of her. The pen in her hand felt heavy, as if it were a tool of some far-off destiny that she could no longer reach. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one who could rise above everything: her family, her struggles, her own shortcomings. But as she sat there, she realized that strength had been nothing more than a mask, a facade to hide from the truth she had long avoided. The truth was painful. Her mind returned to moments she had long buried, moments where she had failed, moments where she had fallen short, moments when her dreams shattered like glass, leaving only jagged pieces of broken hope. She thought back to the times when she had fainted from the mere sight of blood, her fear so deep that it felt like an insurmountable weakness. She had thought she could overcome it, that she could push through, but every time she was reminded of how fragile she truly was. "How can I call myself strong when I'm so terrified of something as simple as blood?" she thought bitterly. Those moments of weakness weren't just physical. They had seeped into her very essence, poisoning her confidence and leaving scars that had never fully healed. She had tried to bury them under a facade of success, striving to become someone better, someone capable of handling the weight of the world. But now, with every quiet reflection, those scars had risen to the surface, demanding to be seen, demanding to be addressed. Her failures weren't confined to the physical. They were woven into her relationship with her family, especially with her mother. Qiao Bailu had always tried to prove her worth, to show that she was someone deserving of recognition. Yet, every failure she experienced was tied to a deeper, more painful truth. She had always felt like she could never live up to her mother's expectations. Her mother, who had sacrificed so much, who had always hoped for a daughter who would surpass all the hurdles, only to see her struggle and fail. Every time Qiao Bailu faced a setback, she felt it like a blow to her mother's spirit, a weight she couldn't bear. It wasn't just about her. It was about her family, about the lives they had built for, the expectations they had placed on her shoulders. Every mistake, every failure, every stumble felt like an irreparable fracture in their bond. She wasn't just failing herself. She was failing them too. Her eyes drifted to the small photo on her desk, a picture of her family from when she was young. In the image, she stood proudly beside her mother, her father, and her brother. All smiles, all hope. That image, once a symbol of her potential, now felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had let slip away. She had spent so much time chasing a dream that she thought would validate her, that she never stopped to realize the cost it had come at. Her family had always been there, but she had failed to notice. She had failed to recognize the quiet sacrifices, the love, the unspoken support, and in return, she had given them nothing but disappointment. "I'm not who they thought I'd be," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, lost in the room's silence. "I'm not even who I thought I'd be." The weight of her self-doubt pressed in on her chest, suffocating her, with the realization that she had been running from herself, from the truth of her own inadequacies. She had always believed that if she could just become successful, if she could just prove herself, everything would be okay. But now she understood that success wasn't a solution. It was just another way of hiding, of avoiding the very things that made her human. She had failed, and she had failed hard. Her ambitions had been her refuge, but now they felt like a trap, a cage she had built around herself in an attempt to avoid confronting the painful truths that lay beneath the surface. "What have I really done?" she asked herself. "What have I accomplished that means anything?" In that moment, she saw herself clearly for the first time. She wasn't the person she had always imagined. She wasn't the invincible, successful woman who would rise above and change the world. No, she was just a girl trying to survive, trying to find a place where she could feel worthy of the love and support she had always taken for granted. And the truth was, she had never truly loved herself. She had never been able to, because how could she? How could she love herself when she had failed so miserably in the eyes of those she loved the most? How could she love herself when her dreams felt like a hollow echo, a fleeting fantasy she could never quite grasp? As she sat there, her thoughts spiraling deeper into despair, a thought broke through the fog of self-pity. "I can't keep doing this," she realized. "I can't keep pretending that I'm okay when I'm not. I can't keep running from the truth." For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her failure. It wasn't just the missed opportunities or the abandoned dreams. It was the toll it had taken on her spirit, the way it had turned her into someone she didn't recognize. She had spent so long trying to prove something to her family, to herself, that she had forgotten to live. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought of her mother, her father, her brother, all the people she had pushed away in her pursuit of a life that had never truly been hers. "I need to change," she thought, "but I don't know how." Qiao Bailu wiped her eyes. taking a deep, shaky breath. The journey ahead would not be easy. She had so much to face, so much to rebuild. But for the first time she understood that change would not come from her dreams alone. It would come from the painful, difficult process of confronting who she really was and learning to accept it. The journey toward redemption, toward healing, was a long one. But as Qiao Bailu looked at the empty page before her, she knew that it was a journey she had no choice but to begin. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the faintest glimmer of hope. Qiao Bailu sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking slightly as she stared at the dim light of the room. The words she had spoken to her brother, Qiao Zhending, echoed in her mind like a haunting melody. "You can do anything if you set your mind to it," she had said to him with unwavering confidence, painting a picture of a bright future, one that she had desperately wanted to believe in. But now, as the silence of the room enveloped her, she realized something that made her feel as though the ground had been ripped from under her. She didn't truly believe the words she had said. Her gaze drifted to the small notebook on her desk, the one where she had scribbled down her grand ambitions. "I will become a famous screenwriter," she had written, a dream she had clung to for years. But the truth was that she had been convincing herself more than anyone else. Her mind was clouded by the chaos of her thoughts. She was not the confident, driven person she had portrayed herself to be. Instead, she was just someone trying to escape her past, running toward a future she wasn't sure would ever come. "What am I really chasing?" she wondered, a deep unease settling in her chest. The idealistic words she had spoken to Zhending now seemed hollow. "I've been lying to myself." The realization hit her like a tidal wave, overwhelming her with the weight of her own self-deception. She had spoken of dreams and success, but in reality, she had been avoiding the messy, painful truths of her own life. What kind of future could she promise her brother when she had no solid footing herself? What kind of sister was she, offering advice that she wasn't even sure would work for her? How could she pretend to be the beacon of light when she had spent so many years hiding in the shadows? For the first time, Qiao Bailu felt herself breaking down the walls she had built around her own dreams. She no longer saw them as a path to salvation, but as a means of running away. Her identity had become so tangled in the idea of success that she had forgotten the real meaning of progress. It wasn't about the accolades, the recognition, or the applause. It was about facing the truth, confronting her own fears, and learning to accept herself, flaws and all. As she sat there pondering these thoughts, a new realization began to form in her mind. I need something real. For the first time, Qiao Bailu didn't want to just build a dream for herself. She didn't want to chase an illusion of success anymore. She wanted something she could hold in her hands, something that wasn't just a reflection of her ambitions, but a true expression of who she was. And then the idea came to her. She would write a novel. It wasn't just a way to prove her worth or to escape. No, it was something different. Writing a novel would be her first step toward facing her own fears. It would be an exploration of her own vulnerabilities, her own pain, and her own journey. She would pour everything into the pages, not just the stories she longed to tell, but the stories she had been hiding from. This would be her new goal, not to escape her failures, but to confront them and use them to fuel her growth. She grabbed her pen and began writing in her notebook again, her thoughts flowing freely. The story will be about redemption, about a journey through darkness to find light, she wrote. For the first time, she felt a sense of clarity. The story was no longer just a dream. It was something she needed to do, something that would allow her to rebuild herself from the ground up. Later that evening, when her brother, Qiao Bailu, walked into the room, he didn't say anything at first. His eyes were distant, almost tired, as if the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders, and he didn't know how to carry it anymore. He sat down across from Qiao Bailu, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Qiao Bailu, for once, didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words of encouragement or promises of a bright future. Instead, she simply stared at him, wondering if he could see the change in her, if he could sense the shift in her that had only just begun to take root. "You still think I can do it?" Genting asked, his voice quieter than usual, almost fragile. He was always so guarded, so closed off, but now there was something in his eyes that betrayed his uncertainty. His usual defiance had faded, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. For a moment, Qiao Bailu hesitated. She thought about her own failures, her own doubts, and the emptiness she had been running from. Could she still hold on to the idea that anyone could make it if they just tried hard enough? Could she honestly tell him that his future would be bright if he followed her advice, when she didn't even know where hers was headed? "I don't know anymore," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's waiting for us, Genting, but I do know that we can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." He looked at her, his eyes searching for something, maybe an answer, maybe hope, but there was no easy answer. They had both been running from their fears for so long that they didn't know how to face them. But in that moment, in the raw honesty of their exchange, something shifted. The walls between them that had grown so thick over the years seemed to crack, just a little. "I've been so caught up in trying to make something out of nothing," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so much time thinking I could build my way out of the dark. But maybe the first step is just accepting the darkness instead of pretending it isn't there." Genting remained silent, his gaze steady, and for the first time, Qiao Bailu felt like he was truly listening to her, not as the older sister who always had the answers, but as someone who was just as lost as he was. She didn't know what would happen next, or if their conversation would change anything, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to convince him of a false hope. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, her words carrying more weight than any promise of a bright future. "We'll figure it out together." And in that quiet moment, something began to heal, slowly, imperceptibly, but it was there, the first step toward redemption, the first step toward embracing the truth. Qiao Bailu sat in her small room, staring at the blank page before her. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional creak of the floor beneath her. Outside, the world moved on, but in this moment, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. 2 months. She had made a promise to herself that she would finish her novel in that time. An impossible deadline, one she had set with a mixture of determination and desperation. She was betting everything on this. "I will not let this be another failure," she whispered to herself, clenching her fists at her sides. She had failed too many times in her life to count, and for once she couldn't afford to let the fear of failure control her anymore. It was an agonizing decision, one that had forced her to confront her deepest fears, the fear of disappointing everyone again, the fear of falling short, the fear of being nothing more than a shadow of her own dreams. But despite the doubts, despite the nagging voice inside her that told her to give up, Qiao Bailu chose to push forward. She chose to make this dream real. She had to. Her family didn't understand. They didn't see the late nights, the sleepless hours spent writing furiously into the early morning, trying to force the words out, trying to shape something meaningful from the chaos of her mind. They didn't understand that this wasn't just about becoming a successful writer. It was about proving to herself that she could rise from the ashes of her past, that she could turn her failures into something tangible, something real. Her mother had never understood her desire to write. To her, a career in writing was an impractical fantasy, a frivolous pursuit when compared to the practical work that needed to be done in the family. "Why don't you just focus on something that will bring you stability?" Her mother had asked a few days earlier, her voice filled with concern, but also a quiet disappointment. "Why waste your time on something that may never pay off?" But Qiao Bailu had made her decision. She was going to write, and she was going to finish her novel. No more distractions, no more second-guessing. "I will not be like the rest of them," she had sworn silently, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. "I will not give up." As the days passed, her determination only grew stronger, but so did the doubts. Every word she wrote felt like a battle, each sentence a small victory. And yet, with each passing moment, the pressure mounted. The clock was ticking. She had promised herself that she would finish within 2 months. But was she really ready for this? Could she really turn her dream into a reality? Or was this another illusion, another failed attempt to escape the things she couldn't control? The fear was suffocating, creeping up on her with every keystroke. What if it was never enough? What if she couldn't finish? What if it's not good enough to even be published? The self-doubt gnawed at her with a ferocity she hadn't anticipated. And yet, beneath the fear, something else burned brightly, a small, flickering flame of belief that perhaps, just perhaps, she could do this. Maybe this time, it would be different. "If I don't change, nothing will ever change," she thought. "If I don't take this risk, I'll never know what could have been." But even with that belief, the fear remained. a constant presence at the back of her mind. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the thought of failing again or the thought of succeeding and finally confronting the reality of her own success. Would she be able to handle it? Would she be able to stand on her own? Or would she fall apart under the weight of her own expectations? It was then that Jiayuan walked into her life like a sudden gust of wind, blowing away the cobwebs of doubt that had clouded her thoughts. Their conversations, though never particularly deep, had always had a subtle impact on her. He wasn't the type to give advice, nor was he the one to push her when she didn't want to be pushed, but his presence was steady, grounding her in a way she had never realized before. It wasn't until that one evening when they sat together, quietly talking about everything and nothing, that Qiao Bailu realized how much his support meant to her. She hadn't even known she needed it until she felt it. "Are you really going to finish it?" Xie Jiayuan had asked, his voice steady, his gaze sharp, but not judgmental. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how much she had been waiting for someone to ask, for someone to believe in her, even when she wasn't sure if she could believe in herself. "I will," she said, the words surprising her as they left her lips. There was no hesitation, no fear in her voice, only determination, something she hadn't felt in a long time. He nodded, offering no further encouragement, but his quiet confidence in her was enough. It was all she needed. His belief in her was the quiet anchor that kept her grounded, that allowed her to keep moving forward even when everything felt like it was slipping away. "I know you will," he said, his voice gentle but full of certainty. It was a simple statement, but it carried with it the weight of something deeper, a belief that, perhaps for the first time, Qiao Bailu wasn't just trying to escape the shadows of her past. She was ready to step into the light, to face whatever challenges lay ahead, no matter how daunting they seemed. In the days that followed, Qiao Bailu threw herself into her writing with a new intensity. She still faced the overwhelming weight of self-doubt, but now there was something else to balance it out, a quiet sense of belief, a small flicker of hope that refused to go out. She had to prove herself, not to anyone else, but to herself. She had to show that she was capable of more than just surviving. She had to show that she could rise, not just for her family, but for herself. And in the midst of her writing, Qiao Bailu began to understand something that she hadn't fully realized before. It wasn't just about the novel, or even about her dreams. It was about the journey, the willingness to face the fear, to confront the past, and to keep moving forward even when the path seemed unclear. It was about trusting herself enough to take the leap, even if the fall was uncertain. As the days turned into weeks, Qiao Bailu found herself writing with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't writing to prove something to her family, or even to the world. She was writing to prove to herself that she could change, that she could overcome the mistakes of her past, and that, at the end of it all, she could stand tall and say, "I did this. I did it for me." And, in a strange way, it was Xi Jiayuan's quiet presence, his unwavering belief in her, that had been the catalyst for her transformation. His faith, though unspoken, had been the spark she needed to ignite the fire of her own self-belief. I'm not doing this alone anymore, Qiao Bailu thought as she continued to write. And for the first time, I'm not afraid to see where this path will take me. As the days passed, Qiao Bailu's world became a swirling mix of ambition, self-doubt, and a growing sense of understanding about her family. The novel, once just a distant goal, was now a tangible reality she had to face, and it was pushing her in ways she hadn't expected. Every evening, as she sat in the dim light of her room, her fingers danced across the keyboard, weaving a story that wasn't just about escape. It was about confronting herself, confronting her failures, and understanding what had been missing all along. But as much as she had thrown herself into her work, there was something deeper calling to her, something she had been neglecting for far too long. Her brother, Qiao Zhending, the person she had so often written off as lazy and hopeless, had begun to haunt her thoughts in a way she hadn't expected. It was a simple moment that had sparked the change. One afternoon, after she had written a particularly difficult section of her novel, she found herself sitting across from him at the dinner table. He had barely said a word, his face expressionless as always, his eyes lost in some faraway thought. But as she glanced at him, something shifted. She saw him not as the disappointment she had always thought him to be, but as someone lost, someone who had never been given the chance to find his way. Her gaze softened as she remembered the past few weeks, the arguments they'd had, the quiet silences that had grown between them. She realized now that she had been so focused on her own dreams that she had failed to see the silent struggle her brother had been going through. It wasn't that he was a failure. It was that he had never been given the tools to succeed. Never had anyone truly believe in him. Qiao Zhending's reluctance to go to school, his withdrawn nature, it wasn't defiance. It was fear of never being enough, of never being seen as someone who could measure up. And for the first time, Qiao Bailu understood. I've been blind, she thought. I've been so obsessed with my own vision that I never truly saw him. Her heart tightened with guilt. How many times had she scolded him for his failures, never once pausing to ask why? How many times had she looked at him with disappointment, never understanding the deep insecurities that had held him captive all this time? Qiao Bailu sighed and set her pen down. The words she had written on the page now blurred in her vision. The future she had been chasing, the dreams of success, now seemed so small compared to the truth she had just uncovered about her brother. I need to do better, she thought, the weight of the realization sinking in. Her journey was not just about her own success anymore. It was about understanding those around her, about being there for the people who mattered most. And that meant her brother. She didn't know how to fix the past, but she knew she had to try. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of her own dreams. She had to help him, to show him that there was more to life than hiding in the shadows of failure. That night she sat down beside Qiao Zhending, who was sitting in the dim light of the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She hesitated, unsure of how to start, but she knew she couldn't let another day pass without saying something. Zhending, she began, her voice softer than usual. I've been thinking, about everything, about us. He didn't look up at her at first, but she could feel the tension in his shoulders, the wall he had built between them. He had been so distant, so closed off, and for the first time, she realized that it wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he had given up on himself. And in a way, she had given up on him too. I've been so focused on my own dreams, she continued, her words laced with regret. I've been trying to chase something, to prove something to everyone, but I've forgotten the most important thing. She paused, letting the words sink in. I've forgotten about you. I've forgotten how much you matter to me. Qiao. Genting looked up then, his eyes wide, as if he hadn't expected her to say those words. His face softened, but there was still a trace of uncertainty in his gaze. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to let go of the bitterness that had built up over the years. You're not a failure, Genting, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I see that now. You've been carrying so much, and I've never really understood that. I've been so focused on my own fears and dreams that I didn't realize how much you've been struggling. For a moment, there was silence between them. The weight of her words hung in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something different, something vulnerable. She had finally allowed herself to see him, truly see him, for the first time, and she hoped in that moment that he could see her too. I promise you, she said quietly, her voice steady with the determination. I'm going to work harder, not just for me, but for us. I'm going to show you that things can change. I will prove to you that we can change. Her words hung in the air, but they felt more like a promise than an empty declaration. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Her relationship with her brother had been broken for so long, and there was no quick fix to undo the years of disappointment. But this time she was ready. She was ready to put in the effort, to be there for him in the way she had failed to be before. As she stood to leave, she caught his gaze one more time. There was something different in his eyes, something fragile, but real, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of hope. I'm not giving up on you, Genting, she whispered, and I'm not giving up on me either. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, both of them felt as though they were standing on the same ground, ready to take the next step together. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next, as Qiao Bailu threw herself into her work, into her writing. But unlike the frantic pace she had set for herself before, there was a quiet determination behind every word she wrote now. The frantic desperation to prove something to the world had been replaced with a deeper, more peaceful resolve. A resolve to finally face the truth, to stop running from her past, and to embrace the future with open arms. Qiao Bailu's world had changed, and so had she. No longer was she driven by a single-minded desire for success, chasing an illusion of greatness. Now, her pursuit was different. It was no longer about becoming someone others would admire. It was about becoming someone she could respect, a person who could look at herself in the mirror and not flinch at the reflection, a person who could stand tall, not because of external validation, but because she had learned to find peace within herself. The novel was coming together, not just as a work of fiction, but as a reflection of the journey she had taken. It wasn't just about the characters she created or the world she built. It was about her own redemption, her own struggles with fear, failure, and self-doubt. Writing had become her therapy, a way to process the emotions she had buried for so long. It was also her way of closing the chapter on a past filled with regrets, a past that had nearly broken her. But no matter how much progress she made, she knew she couldn't do it alone. She had learned that in the weeks prior. She had learned that healing wasn't just about personal strength. It was about the people you allowed into your life, the relationships you nurtured, and the love you gave and received. And it was through the relationships with her family, especially her brother, that she found the courage to face her own truth. Her conversations with Qiao Bailu had been the turning point. They hadn't been easy. There were still moments of tension, moments when the silence between them spoke louder than words. But slowly they began to rebuild their relationship. She saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he had kept hidden for so long. And she saw for the first time that he was capable of more than she had given him credit for. They didn't need grand gestures to fix their bond. They just needed to be honest with each other, to acknowledge their shared pain, and to move forward side by side. That evening, after another long day of writing, she sat down with him again, their dinner table now a symbol of new beginnings rather than old tensions. Qiao Bailu was quieter than usual, but there was a calmness to him that hadn't been there before. "I'm proud of you," she said, the words coming out before she even realized it. She hadn't said them to him in years, and they felt strange on her tongue. But they were true. Genting looked up from his plate, his eyes meeting hers. The usual deflection wasn't there. Instead, there was something else. A flicker of acknowledgement, a glimpse of the brother she had always wanted to understand. "Thanks," he replied, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. Qiao Bailu smiled, the weight in her chest lightening just a little. She realized in that moment that they were no longer just sibling figures moving in parallel, each stuck in their own worlds. They were partners in this life, facing the same uncertainties, but willing to confront them together. Later, she sat with her parents, the weight of the conversation feeling lighter than it ever had before. For so long, she had avoided speaking to them about her dreams, thinking they would never understand. But now, after everything, she realized that avoiding the truth only kept them at a distance. Her father, who had always been quietly supportive but never understood her creative ambitions, sat across from her at the table, watching her intently. He had never asked her about her writing before, had never seen it as anything more than a fleeting fantasy. But now, there was something different in his eyes. "Are you really serious about this?" he asked, his voice gruff but genuine. Qiao Bailu nodded, her hands steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Yes, this time I'm not turning back. This is who I am now, her mother, who had always been concerned with practicality, with stability, looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and something softer, perhaps acceptance. "Do you think this will really work out?" she asked, her voice still tinged with doubt. "I don't know," Qiao Bailu admitted honestly. "But I can't keep running from myself. I can't keep pretending I'm happy doing anything else. Writing isn't just a dream for me anymore. It's how I move forward." Her mother nodded slowly, and for the first time in a long while, Qiao Bailu felt a sense of understanding between them. The weight of her mother's expectations had always loomed large in her life, but now it seemed lighter. She wasn't asking for their approval anymore. She was asking for their understanding, for their support, in whatever form it took, and that, in itself, felt like a victory. In the weeks that followed, Qiao Bailu continued to write, but now each word carried more than just the weight of her ambition. It carried the understanding that she was no longer alone in her journey. Her relationship with her brother had deepened. Her parents had begun to accept her path, and for the first time, she felt like she was not only fighting for herself, but for the people she loved. But it wasn't just about the novel or the success she hoped to find. It was about the person she had become in the process. She had stopped running from her past, stopped hiding behind illusions of success, and started to embrace the truth of her own humanity. She was no longer just the girl who wanted to prove herself. She was the woman who had faced her fears, who had seen the parts of herself she had once been afraid of, and had chosen to move forward anyway. Qiao Bailu was no longer the lonely, broken figure she had once been. She was a sister, a daughter, a writer, and above all, she was someone who had learned that the only way to move forward was to first accept who she was. And with that acceptance came a strength she had never known before. Her journey was far from over, but now she was ready to face whatever came next, whether it was the success she had always dreamed of, or the challenges she still needed to overcome, and in that she found peace. "I will no longer be afraid of the future," she thought, "because I know that no matter what happens, I can face it." Qiao Bailu's journey was one of transformation, a path from self-doubt and frustration to acceptance and growth. She began as a young woman trapped by the weight of her past, a past filled with unhealed wounds, unmet expectations, and a deep sense of inadequacy. She had always believed that success would validate her, that it would erase the failures that haunted her. But as the story unfolded, Qiao Bailu discovered that the true key to healing and moving forward wasn't in chasing success, but in confronting the truths she had long avoided. Her journey started with a single painful realization. She had been running from herself for far too long. The facade of ambition and self-reliance she had built around herself began to crack, revealing the underlying fears and insecurities that had shaped her. In her search for something to prove to others, she had neglected to look inward, to face the deeper issues that were holding her back. Her relationship with her family, particularly with her brother Zhao Zhending, had been strained by this very distance. She had seen him only as a failure, without recognizing his own pain and potential. As Qiao Bailu began to shift her perspective, she realized that true strength came from vulnerability and acceptance. The turning point came when she allowed herself to truly see her brother, not as a source of disappointment, but as someone who, like her, was struggling to find his place in a world that often felt unforgiving. Their bond, once fractured, began to heal as she opened herself to understanding him, and in doing so, understood herself better. Her decision to write a novel was symbolic of this new chapter in her life. Writing was no longer just a way to escape or prove something to the world. It was a way to confront her fears, to face her vulnerabilities, and to find meaning in her own experiences. With each word she wrote, she confronted her past, processed her pain, and slowly began to rebuild herself, not as the girl who had always been driven by external validation, but as the woman who had found peace in accepting who she was, flaws and all. Her relationships with her family evolved as well. Her mother, once a figure of unmet expectations, became a source of understanding. The conversations with her parents were no longer filled with judgment, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the paths they each had to walk. Qiao Bailu learned that her family's love and support were not conditional upon her success. They were rooted in something much deeper, something that could weather the storm of disappointment and fear. By the end of her journey, Qiao Bailu had become someone new. She was no longer the lonely, isolated girl fighting against the world. She was a woman who had learned the value of change, not as a means of escaping her past, but as a way of embracing her true self. Though her journey was still ongoing, she now understood that every step forward was a part of her personal growth. She had accepted that life would not always be easy, that challenges would continue to arise, but she was no longer afraid of them, because in every struggle she had found a deeper understanding of who she was, and that was enough. Qiao Bailu's story ended on an open note, leaving room for growth and further challenges. But it was clear that no matter what came next, she had learned to move forward with grace, strength, and the unwavering belief that she could overcome anything, as long as she stayed true to herself.